Welcome to the HC Commodities Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. This podcast is produced by HC Group, a global search firm dedicated to the commodities sector. Today we're talking COP29, Article 6 and the carbon markets. In mid-November in Azerbaijan, momentous decisions could be made that would really advance the carbon markets globally. What are they, and what are the chances of that happening? And what is the state of the carbon market today? Our guest is Nick Marshall. Nick has had 25 years' experience in around voluntary and compliance carbon markets as well as financing, and is the co-founder of TASC, a project developer focused on channeling funds into carbon reduction projects around the world, particularly in the emerging markets, for both compliance and voluntary credits. As always, you can really support the show by leaving us a positive review on the platform you're listening on, particularly Apple or Spotify. It really does supercharge those algorithms and allow us to continue to get great guests. And as always, I hope you enjoy the episode. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul. Nice to be here.
So this in many ways is a part two to the episode we did with Ariel Perez earlier in the year. And we're talking about COP, the upcoming COP in November, COP29, Article 6 specifically, and the carbon markets themselves. But we've got a fair amount, and this is for my benefit, fair amount of sort of ground laying before we get there. Can you just start, I guess really at the start, how does the Paris Agreement compare to the initial Kyoto Agreement?
Yeah, sure. That's an important question, first question to ask. And I'd like to caveat all of my answers and everything that I say by saying that I am not a policy expert. So we're obviously a commercial organization set up to take advantage of carbon markets, which fall off the back really of policy developments. But having worked in this for almost 25 years, I've got a reasonable appreciation of some of the machinations at the policy level. And the key difference between the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol is principally in the way that it's designed, in the way that it's designed for countries to engage. And the Kyoto Protocol was very much a top-down approach. So it was sort of dictating terms, if you like, as to what the targets for countries should be and how they can achieve those targets. And the Paris Agreement, by comparison, is very much bottom up. So it places the emphasis on host countries or the countries themselves, parties, to develop their own mechanism, their own approaches and their own targets, with the broad premise that we have to achieve an emissions reduction that gets us on a curve to achieve no more than 2 degrees of warming. So it's very different in its approach, and that's a kind of that theme runs through everything that is developed under each of those two initiatives.
Those two approaches, how have they fared? I mean, we obviously have some, Europe, for example, that are very progressive around trying to tackle carbon emissions. People argue that that's also a nature of theirs relatively hydrocarbon poor in terms of resources. How is that? I mean, but roughly speaking, how has that fared using that bottom-up approach? Has that created quite a suite of disparity?
Yeah, sure. So, of course, the other crucial difference between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement is that under Kyoto, really it was the developed world, as it was sort of defined under the protocol, that was targeted with firm emissions reduction targets. Whereas under the Paris Agreement, it's sort of like a one for all for one approach, whereby every country is due to set out their own pathway to reducing emissions in line with the overall goal. And so under the Kyoto Protocol, really what you saw was sort of systems and processes set up that were geared towards developed world countries reaching their targets. And of course, the Kyoto Protocol had three what they call flexibility mechanisms to enable countries to reach those targets. There was emissions trading, the Clean Development Mechanism, and joint implementation, all of which were implemented. Each of those flexibility mechanisms were implemented, possibly most successfully or well known under the EU emissions trading scheme, which still exists to this day. the Clean Development Mechanism, of course, that was the mechanism that engaged the developing world in the process, which allowed for project-based investments to take place, which encouraged sort of technology transfer, which encouraged capacity building, and of course, financial flows into the developing world. But it was very much limited to how much the developed world implemented the systems and processes. So, of course, the US being a bit of an outlier, having not really implemented any of those flexibility mechanisms. So the pool of available capital, if you like, to invest into emissions reduction projects in the developing world was somewhat limited. Although, at that point, China and India very much took advantage of those mechanisms and actually generated quite a lot of projects and a significant amount of investment. Now, the Paris Agreement sort of turns that on its head a little bit. And as I said before, it sort of puts destiny into the hands of every country that signs the agreement. So they can take advantage of other mechanisms that are now being put in place under the Paris Agreement, particularly around Article 6, which we'll no doubt get into. And they can, in effect, set their own frameworks to how exactly those mechanisms will be implemented. Of course, underlying the Paris Agreement is every country sets their nationally determined contribution, which is, mapping out what their emissions profile is as a country, and how exactly they intend to meet the reduction pathway that they set. And as is mostly the case, a lot of developing world countries say, well, yeah, this is our position, this is our pathway, but what's missing is finance. And of course, that's a key component to the Paris Agreement as well, is how exactly each of these nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, will be met, either by financing national investment strategies, or development-based finance, or climate finance under the Paris Agreement, or equally carbon finance, which might come under the sort of Article 6 mechanism. So it's now potentially a much broader approach to dealing with global emissions than existed under the Kyoto Protocol.
Let's lead into Article 6. I guess the countries being voluntarily cooperating with one another to reduce emissions. Centrally to that is compliance markets and essentially emissions trading. What is Article 6? What are its components, and where does it sit today? And then I also want to bring in that financing piece as well. But this is quite a big chunky question. I get it.
To give a little bit of background, a little bit of history, I did at least some homework in advance of this podcast. So the Paris Agreement was signed, of course, in 2015 in COP29, which was sort of set the general framework for how the world was going to meet this 2-degree target. Then in Glasgow in 2021, under COP26, they agreed the Glasgow Climate Pact, and that fixed sort of 3 key factors. One was finance for adaptation. So previously, really, the focus had been on mitigation of emissions, but it became recognized that adaptation needed to be addressed and how that would be financed. There was also provisions for transparency and reporting. So what's called the Paris Agreement Rulebook, which is how countries will report against their NDCs, which I mentioned previously. And then finally was Article 6 and how the rules around it, Article 6 would be implemented. And really there's sort of 3 key factors to that. The first one, what's called cooperative approaches, which is sort of references Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement. And these are very much bilateral, or can be very much bilateral approaches to trading emissions, in effect. So, country A will sign, for example, a bilateral agreement with country B to set the framework around how carbon finance will flow into projects, what types of projects, what types of methodologies, and country B will set the premises around emissions reporting, having a registry system. And in effect, and this is one of the sort of has been one of the really tricky elements of Article 6, to prevent double counting of emissions. So if what that means is that if one country develops a emissions reduction project and in effect sells as a carbon credit those emissions reductions to another country, it has to correspondingly adjust its own national registry. So it's not counting those emissions reductions twice. So it's not counting them against its own NDC whilst also selling them to another country who counts it against their NDC. So that's a crucial aspect of this is ensuring that that corresponding adjustment process takes place. So that was the sort of that's the Article 6.2 approach. And we've seen.
Just staying on 6.2, can you give us one or two or an example? And is this a mechanism by which a European country does a bilateral agreement with Kenya or wherever it might be, and that carbon credit generated can then end up in the European ETS scheme? Or I don't know, this sounds completely idiotic to you, but like, yeah, help us with an example.
Not entirely, not entirely. So examples have been, obviously, well, one good example is Switzerland, although Switzerland sits outside of the EU ETS, so I'm not being hugely helpful. But Switzerland, but I'll explain why it wouldn't be relevant anyway. But Switzerland, in effect, has been signing bilateral agreements with countries around the world, particularly with Ghana, I think, is one of their partner countries. And what they have established within the Ministry of Environment in Switzerland is almost their own infrastructure around how to approve projects and how to, in inverted commas, register them with the Swiss government that makes them eligible under this bilateral agreement. And so project developers have been actively kind of pitching ideas to the Swiss government, and in effect you need to get double approval. You need to get an approval from the Swiss government, and then you need to get an approval from Ghana. But in effect, the mechanism is there to enable those approvals to happen. And of course, there's been a lot of capacity building around those bilateral agreements. But ultimately, what will happen is that if you get the go-ahead as a project developer, and this is why it leverages private investment, right? So you then can leverage private investment against a fixed price contract with the Swiss government to invest in a project in Ghana. And once you've sort of implemented that project and it's delivering, it's started to become operational and it's delivering emissions reductions, you then go via the mechanism to the Swiss government, apply for the in effect the credits, and they pay you per ton of emission that you reduce. That's not a fungible. I used the word credit, but it's not really a credit. It's not a fungible mechanism. You can't sell that credit anywhere else. You're locked in to selling it to the Swiss government, and they've approved it, and it's not eligible anywhere else. So it can never be, and it goes directly into the Swiss government's registry, right? So they will count it at the national registry against their own emissions. And so the emissions trading scheme doesn't work in concert with that at all, because the emissions trading scheme is a corporate level tool that drives reductions in sectors, in certain industry sectors in Europe. And so you're talking the difference between a sort of corporate level accounting or sector level accounting, which of course goes into the national accounting, but at the top of it sits the government, and the government is saying, okay, we can reduce emissions in these sectors, but we're also going to bring in some additional emissions reductions from elsewhere to help us meet our NDC targets. And so there's no fungibility between Article 6.2 and sort of emissions trading approaches in Europe.
Well, that was excellent. Okay, so then you've got Article 6.4, which I guess is the broader mechanism by which all of this could be tied together in the future, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see what happens to Article 6.2 in the long term, because, of course, Article 6.2 initiatives can be implemented quite quickly, and they are being implemented now. Whereas Article 6.4 is, in effect, the UNFCCC's mechanism. So it's this sort of centralized, kind of like the successor of the Clean Development Mechanism.
That's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, just for the.
Correct. Yeah. Correct. Who typically is responsible for the implementation of these of the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. So, Article 6.4 would be a sort of centralized mechanism controlled by the UNFCCC, against which you can approve projects. There's approved methodologies. All of the rules of the game will be in place at the UN level, just as it was under the CDM, and countries may decide whether they will engage with that mechanism or not, and they will build their own sort of country level frameworks of how to kind of connect into that mechanism. But theoretically, that could be the one mechanism to bind them all, if the like your Lord of the Rings type
Yeah, Sauron.
I'm thinking more positively here.
Sauron made the ring, to be clear.
Yeah, true. I mean, I've dealt with UNFCCC in the past, and there are some dark arts at UN level that one has to navigate. But the this mechanism, in effect, can act as the one trading mechanism that sits behind all the climate policy that any country on the world chooses to implement. So I'm from the UK, and the UK could decide to utilize Article 6.4 to offset emissions for certain sectors where it's not achieving its goal by reducing emissions. So, of course, inherent in anything like that is a long process to get those rules approved, and it's taking a long time. There's a lot of politics in there, there's a lot of negotiation. And this is principally why the Dubai last year, COP28, kind of was seen as a failure, because they failed to, or maybe more like a damp squib, they failed to basically agree any of these rules, what projects are eligible, it just didn't happen. There was a lot of arguments, and so it didn't happen. And this is why the next COP29, is being viewed as the sort of finance COP, because they're expecting to really finalize some of these the rule book around Article 6.4. Just for completeness, I feel I should just mention the last element of Article 6, but this is not, being a market-based entity that we are, this is not really of much interest to me, or not something I know a lot about. But there are another provision for non-market-based approaches between parties. So, those might be certain agreements that countries would put together to work together to reduce.
Mitigation,
Yeah, maybe
adaptation.
like a joint implementation thing,
Yeah.
but without a
This is
tradable thing.
6.8.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So I want to go in a little bit into sort of why. So it's been 6.4, I guess, in particular, is one of the sticking points, because people like the Swiss government are going ahead on 6.2 anyway, without its broad approval. So at the moment, just to put a pin in it, you've got a patchwork of different schemes. On the compliance side, you've got some, like these bilateral agreements. You've got some trading schemes like the European trading scheme. We obviously have the voluntary carbon credit side, which we'll touch on at the end. That's more at the corporate level rather than the government register level, and it's had its issues and so forth. So, talking about that approval, is this the approval of Article 6 in particular, or one of these, or 6.4 or 6.2? And what are the sort of, broadly speaking, the major holdups?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, and one that I don't feel wholly qualified to answer, other than to say that Article 6 is approved, right? It's in the Paris Agreement, and you have, from Glasgow, you have this climate pact to agree to implementing Article 6, to sort of move it to the next level. So what we're missing, the piece that we're missing, is really the rules of the game to operationalize it. So exactly how countries go about setting up the infrastructure that's going to enable the finance to flow into these projects and enable those sort of emissions reductions to be converted into credits and utilized in national accounting systems. So it's really the operationalizing of those already agreed elements. So the framework is there. It's putting the rubber to the road now, and that is the crucial piece, of course, for any investor to kind of give things a green light and to really set in motion the financial flows that are needed, for countries to achieve their targets. Because at the moment, without it, you're in a state of limbo. Quite simply put, you have the voluntary market that you alluded to, and we can talk about that. And the voluntary market is great in many ways because it encourages innovation, it encourages new methodologies, it encourages new technologies, all this sort of stuff. But there's just not enough liquidity in it. There's not enough to develop long-term sustainable business plans that project developers can utilize to scale to the level that we need to scale to, that will address the problem that we're trying to address. So this is why I guess Baku is, or COP29 is being called the finance COP, because if you, in theory, if you put these mechanisms in place and you get them functioning, much like you did under the CDM, but to probably a more limited level, you will start to see the leveraging of significant quantities of private capital that will invest in the sort of solutions that are needed to address climate change. And of course, once, I very much believe personally that once you sort of open those floodgates, and once you put that in motion, that's when you really will start to see technologies that we know that are proven, have been utilized often in sort of the developed world, to provide the finance mechanisms that allow those to scale internationally all through the developing world. And that's really what, when we talk to any host governments, that's what they want. They want this to happen. And so to develop basically a functioning global carbon market, particularly under Article 6.4, that is the key to the lock, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it'd be a huge shot in the arm. And I guess a lot of the bets, and I'm assuming this, a lot of the bets around the voluntary market are that under this mechanism, they would then become compliant markets as well, right? Which would be, presumably for valuations and so forth, would be significant as well.
We as an organization, we've been working carbon markets for, like I said at the beginning, for sort of 25 years. And we started off in compliance markets. And so we were doing a lot of origination of renewable energy projects in China, a lot of sort of landfill gas, waste heat recovery, industrial projects, China, India, some what would not now probably be considered to be developing world countries. But we saw, during when the EU ETS was in operation and the CDM was in operation, we saw a level of financing that was, you were tapping into mainstream financial markets to, I think, pretty much for the first time ever, to address an environmental problem. And once those investors started to understand the system, understand the levels of liquidity, the demand, all this kind of stuff, you could see it started pushing the buttons of the main banks, the trading houses, all of these guys who would be extremely wary of the voluntary carbon market as it currently exists. Because what you have under the voluntary carbon market, and like we can debate this, but where does the demand come from? I mean, it comes from, in effect, the whim of some companies saying, well, yes, we think we should do something about climate change, and we should offset our emissions. But from one day to the next, they could decide not to, and companies have done that. Look at EasyJet, for example. They suddenly turn around one year and they say, well, we're not going to do that. And so how do you, as an investor, sort of, where do you put your flag in the sand to say this, we can rely on this market? You simply can't. So what it means is that you have a voluntary market that really isn't fit for purpose to deal with the problem, which is, climate change, right?
And you've got such volatility at the sort of the country political level at the moment, right? As well, and we see that in biofuels and the rest of it. So actually having that global agreement gives a hell of a lot more confidence than relying on regional country level policy that might change with the next administration.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you always have, yeah, there's no getting away from political risk. In particularly, yeah, in a lot of countries, it's a change of government can see a change of policy, and that's part of life. But once countries are plugged into the Paris Agreement system, in effect, they are hooked into the machine, right? And so all that, particularly what I was talking about with tapping into mainstream financial markets, it opens a door for these countries to access finance that they would never have otherwise got hold of. And so once you're sort of tapped into that, it's very difficult for a subsequent government, no matter how ideologically charged they might be, to turn that off and say, actually, no, we're not. Yeah, we're not going to do that. So you're right. Once you've sort of engaged at the sort of the international treaty level, let's say, it's as an investor, you're in a much better place, and we know that from our conversations with investors. They'll say, look, if you guys can get host country approval, Article 6 approved mechanisms, we'll invest. And they'll say we'll do that tomorrow. So that's why I talk about limbo, because you are in a state of limbo at the moment. Of course, there's some investment going on. You'll see press releases about Microsoft investing in carbon removals and these, and that's wonderful stuff, and it drives innovation, but it's still not delivering the level of demand that we need, and that's can only be done internationally.
Oh, well, and this is also at a period when global international development aid is shrinking and is relatively small compared to previous decades as well. So you've had this longer period of small countries actually really struggling to access financing in itself. So it would be hugely transformative, not just in terms of emissions, but also for many developing economies as well. Just on that getting the meat on the bone, the actual implementation rules around this. Do we have any sense, and I ask this with trepidation given where I'm based, any sense on which countries or sort of blocks are causing the most headaches there?
Traditionally, and I think it's still the case to some degree, is that you have the US that would like a pretty liberal approach to market implementation, but it negotiates it the hell out of it to get there, and then doesn't implement at the end of the day. So it would be of and that could be a major political risk, bearing in mind we have an election coming up in the US, obviously in a couple of months' time, as to what is the role that the US will play in all of this going forward. And that is not something I would like to predict. The EU, on the other hand, is much more sort of wary and much more keen on regulation, and having very strong regulation around how this is all implemented, and so can be also, I think, from what I understand, a bit of a tricky negotiating partner.
The energy and resources sector is experiencing unprecedented change. To help companies navigate this world and capture its opportunities, HC Group launched Enco Insights in 2023. Enco has rapidly become the leading global expert network dedicated to energy and resources. Enco Insights leverages HC Group's 20 years of connections and dedication to the sector to give clients the expertise they need to take decisions fast. Connect with Enco's experts for anything from a 1-hour insight call to a longer-term consulting project at encoinsights.com.
Is CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is that sort of in the absence of Article 6 really moving forwards, or is it sort of antithetical to Article 6 in some senses? Europe has just gone ahead and created its own mechanism, or is it irrelevant we're talking about?
No, it's interesting. CBAM is so we're busy in South Africa, where South Africa implemented a carbon tax a couple of years ago, and that carbon tax is I mean, it's pretty incredible, really, for a country like South Africa. It's very sort of progressive in nature to bring a carbon tax to an economy like South Africa. But one of the things I understood about it was that, South Africa does a lot of trade with Europe. And one of the way they were really worried about the implementation of CBAM and what that would do, to their essentially to their economic competitiveness in Europe. So as a sort of as a mechanism to avoid CBAM, they implemented this carbon tax, to demonstrate that they, because of course CBAM is all about not sourcing from higher emissions jurisdictions. So they're saying, well, look, we're putting in place a mechanism, a legislated mechanism to reduce emissions sector wide in South Africa, with a view that would sort of make them compliant with CBAM and not eligible to any further tariffs in effect. So I think CBAM was a classic case of maybe the EU trying to leverage their economic position to encourage countries to engage with climate change on a broader agenda. And it seems like if what I've just said is true.
Well, it's clever, isn't it? It's like you're either going to pay money to the EU or you can pay it to yourself.
Absolutely, it's 100%.
And so it does affect change outside of the borders of the EU.
100%. Yeah. So just that revenue doesn't go. It doesn't. There's no leakage of that revenue. It stays in South Africa.
Will that slide quite nicely as here's a template for Article 6.4, or is it actually another source of, as you kind of alluded to, contention and sort of alternative routes that could derail it, the agreement of how to implement this? I know I'm asking big questions.
No. I mean, difficult one to answer that one, because I think Article 6 and its implementation, I don't think it would satisfy necessarily the EU's sort of CBAM provisions, because unless it was implemented so broadly and so deeply that it generated, in a sort of host party country, emissions reductions across the board, that allowed them to comply with CBAM. So there's not a sort of direct link between those two initiatives necessarily. But of course, really, I think the benefit of Article 6 is for countries who have set, and you can read some of these NDCs that countries have kind of produced, and actually they're not difficult to wade through. They're actually relatively short, a lot of them. Talk sector by sector as to how they're going to address the emissions that are in country. And really, a lot of them, particularly from kind of African countries, will say at the end, we'll do all of this if we can get finance. And that's where Article 6 comes in. It's like, that's one channel to obtain the finance that's needed for countries to reach their NDCs. But of course, they're looking for other types of finance as well via the Paris Agreement, direct finance to deal with sectors that otherwise wouldn't be caught by Article 6, for example.
Fascinating. Okay, so COP29, I think could be momentous. It could really unlock all that investment capital, mainstream investment capital. It could have cascading effects, obviously on emissions, controlling emissions, but also opportunities within the broader commodities sector. I know it's probably, as you've alluded to, it's quite hard to predict right now. Is there any sense of the chances of it happening, or is it really completely unknown at this stage?
No, I think there's certainly a lot of momentum. I think what often happens at these COPs is that you have to go through the trough to get to the peak. And I think when you have a COP like 28, I mean, I think back, there was one in Copenhagen, which was also preceded the Paris Agreement, but was also considered a big failure. Is that everyone looks at each other and says, "Look, guys, we can't. We have to sort this out. The problem is so great. We have to put in, we have to come to some sort of an agreement here." And theoretically, what we're talking about, I mean, I as a bit of an outsider, I look at it and say, well, why are we even negotiating anymore? Surely the deal of negotiating Article 6 has been done. It's just now putting the meat on the bones, and that should be kind of done in some degree, like outside of this whole, big negotiating forum that the COP is. But nonetheless, it seems that it's front and center on the agenda. And I just think that now, having seen the sort of failure at the last COP, that the momentum is there. Particularly, and you see this a lot of sort of developing world countries saying we need these mechanisms to be in place so that we can meet our NDCs. So I think there's definite cause for optimism around fixing the rules. I don't expect it all to be done, like we're sort of done and dusted at the end of the Baku COP, but at least everyone's agreed. Okay, the UNFCCC can crack on with its development of methodologies, and there's question marks over removals methodologies, or RED, which is reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, those types of projects, that will actually make those key decisions so that they can just crack on with it now, because why not, in effect? A lot of the methodologies will be based on methodologies that were previously developed for the clean development mechanism, although refined and updated and all of that. But in effect, the framework is already there. So it's just, I think really, my optimism stems from this fact that they failed at the last one and they can't afford to fail this time round.
Okay, we might check back in for a quick
Yeah,
special
I know.
episode.
I'm gonna regret these words. I know. Yeah.
Okay, so just two more pieces before we end. One would be, I want to talk about TASC, your company. I think it's fascinating what you guys are doing. But firstly, changing tack a little bit, can you just give us a bit of a review of kind of where compliance carbon markets are today? And then obviously the voluntary market has had a bit of a challenging year with numerous sort of high profile issues. Can you just give us a quick sort of lay of the land on those two fronts?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's very fragmented at the moment. Like I say, you have sort of specific initiatives taking place in certain countries around carbon taxes. So you have that in, as I said, South Africa, Chile, Colombia, where there are carbon taxes in place, that will encourage offsetting to some degree as well. So that it develops sort of carbon markets on the back of those approaches. You have other types of mechanisms, for example, in Australia, where they have an emissions reduction fund that the government is backing, to encourage projects in Australia, very much internal. And then, of course, you still have the EU emissions trading scheme, which is taking place, but that is not open to any trading of international credits. That's purely internal to the EU. And then over and above that, really, on a compliance level, is these bilateral agreements, which are very nascent. So, it's very early days. Swiss government, as I said, have been quite advanced with some. Singapore has been developing international linkages, to some degree Japan as well, ostensibly under Article 6.2, but as I say, it's patchy at best. But I would wholly expect at the COP that there will be a whole raft of either memorandums of understanding or bilateral agreements being announced between countries. So you can expect to see that, which would be a boost for the market. Outside of that, then of course, really the only thing that you got, to a degree, I haven't talked about North America. There are sort of schemes in North America that are sort of regional by nature, but outside of that, really, it's the voluntary market, and the voluntary market. It's a volatile beast, and it's something that we know quite well, but. As I say, I don't believe personally that it's fit for purpose to deal with the level of volume that's required to meet any of the challenges.
Excellent. And then great to hear about TASC. And I'm currently wearing a TASC t-shirt, which is a a maker of sports-focused bamboo-based apparel. So we should clear up that.
Well, I'm happy to send you a TASC t-shirt, as in TASC, if you like. We do have them.
No,
So,
this is TASC as well.
is it? Oh, okay. Interesting. Fine. Well, yeah, we're not into making bamboo t-shirts just yet. But I set up TASC with some old colleagues from emissions trading days gone by in 2019, really as a response to what we thought was going to be a second wave of international carbon market activity, and really off the back of the Paris Agreement. And we have particularly strong connections to Africa, where my co-founder is from Zimbabwe. So we were very interested in clean cooking, which is a challenge in and of itself, and probably worth another podcast at some point. But clean cooking is a major problem for Africa in general. And we saw carbon finance as a way to deal with that, to bring new technologies to an age-old activity. And we were anticipating, in effect, a compliance market type approach to this. So we looked at. I haven't mentioned South Korea, but South Korea also has an emissions trading scheme, effectively, and they were soliciting international credits. And so we kind of hooked into that for a period of time. Didn't quite work out. And that's when we sort of shifted stream to the voluntary market. So what we were doing with cooking in Zambia went naturally into a sort of voluntary market type approach. But then we targeted very much South Africa off the back of the carbon tax. And South Africa has been a wonderful sort of base for us. Our operational headquarters in Cape Town, and we run also a clean cooking program in South Africa, where we've distributed about 750,000 cook stoves to as many families. We also are working in regenerative agriculture there. But all of these will deliver emissions reductions that are eligible for companies to buy under the carbon tax mechanism to, in effect, offset some of their carbon tax liabilities. So it's a great story for a South African company to sort of say, yeah, we're complying with the carbon tax, but we're also investing into these very impactful projects that are delivering great benefit to communities in and around South Africa, in effect. So, yeah, we've been very active in South Africa, but we're also active in Australia under the Emissions Reduction Fund there. Yeah, always setting our sights for new jurisdictions, which we're kind of, like I said, this is a little bit of the limbo element of it, is, where will finance flow next, in effect. And you can be sure that we're keeping as close tabs on that to understand where the nearest new jurisdictions will be to invest in.
And a leg up in terms of exactly how financing works, and obviously expertise in this space. So hopefully COP29 will go the way we hope, and be a significant opportunity for you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where the voluntary market really does have. So I feel like I've been a little bit negative about it. So this is where the voluntary market really plays a great role, because, as I said before, it's a real breeding ground for innovation, and all of the approaches that you take to crediting projects with emissions reductions, methodologies, registries, rules and guidance that are in place. A lot of them are, start their life in the voluntary market, and it allows then potentially even the UN, when they're looking at Article 6.4, to kind of cherry pick the best of the voluntary market to implement it under the Paris Agreement. So that is a real benefit of the voluntary market. It does drive finance, a reasonable amount of finance, let's say, into markets that would have seen nothing like that. So we're in rural Zambia, and there's absolutely no way you would get efficient cooking technologies into rural villages in Zambia today at any scale without the voluntary carbon market. So I shouldn't be so
Well,
so
and
down.
actually, the mechanism by which these voluntary markets are holding themselves to a higher standard is so that when this gets actually implemented, the credits that are spun off that voluntary project will be acceptable to the new compliance framework, right? So that is obviously part of the goal, and as you say, they've been a great source of innovation. But as with all things voluntary, not all projects are equal, and not all companies, have held themselves to consistent standards. But I guess we'll leave that there.
Yeah, look, I mean, the main standards in the voluntary market, the gold standard and Vera, they have been adopted sort of wholly by South Africa, for example. They're now, approved under the South African carbon taxes crediting mechanisms. They also have been adopted by Chile, to my knowledge, I think also Colombia. So, they do. And I'm sure if you spoke to them, they would tell you that their future lies for sure within these mechanisms. And under Article 6.2, it is possible to utilize those voluntary carbon market standards to comply. So it's that flexibility is for sure there. Very briefly, you touched on integrity. Of course, as in any market, you have players who are of lower integrity, and the carbon market, of course, is not without those actors, and it's unfortunate. And it's unfortunate in that the media tends to focus on those stories. It's understandable, of course, but they tend to focus on those stories as they emerge rather than the sort of general good news stories that do come out of the voluntary carbon market. I think that there's definitely a case of the market being tarred with the brush of cowboys or whatever. You hear this, that is not the reality that I see. Certainly not from my company. And I know most of the guys who are out there, project developers in the market, and they're absolutely of the highest integrity, and the standards that govern the market are also, it's not regulated, but it is. The standards are very, very detailed in the way that they review the operations of project developers, of projects, the documentation that are produced, the way that emissions reductions are calculated. It's pretty forensic, the way that they address, that they look at these things. Of course, there's an independent audit process as well. Look, that doesn't mean that there can't be bad actors, of course, but I think there are pretty good safeguards out there, and they're evolving also over time. Digitization as digitization comes in, those safeguards become even stronger to ensure that there's a higher degree of quality. The market continues to evolve, it continues to learn, and I can only hope that those lessons will be learnt also when Article 6 starts to be implemented.
Well, a good defence there, and a fascinating discussion. I've really appreciated having you on. We're recording this in late September. It will go out before COP29, but listeners might hear your voice quite quickly again if we have some momentous news out, and we appreciate you coming on for a quick bonus episode to tell us what's happened. But I'll put links to the right TASC in the show notes, and wish you all the success, and thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about HC Group, our global offices, and our expertise in search within the commodities sector, please visit www.hcgroup.global.